of Anthropology for conceiving and supporting the Raising Our Voices on Race, Racism, and Justice lecture series. And I thank my co-presenters, Darren Ranko and Chelsea Fairbank, for their scholarly collaboration in shaping this program. Colonialism is defined as one country or group of people exerting control over another, and colonization involves the action or process of establishing that control over the indigenous people of an area. I feel confident saying anyone watching this lecture knows something about colonization, even if that knowledge solely consists of the opening couplets of Jean Marzola's poem in 1492. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. For most of us, what we have learned about the colonization of the United States has been very superficial, with no moral examination of whether it was justified or the right thing to do. How has one group of people whose ancestors only first arrived on this land approximately 400 years ago, I am speaking of the descendants of Christendom or Western Europe, exert such a level of political control that their occupation threatens the continued political existence of the original nations and peoples of this land who have lived here more than 10,000 years. Before I expound upon today's topic, I want to acknowledge as a white settler that I did not originally conceptualize the doctrine of Christian discovery and domination and give it its descriptive name. That credit belongs to Vine Deloria Jr., Steve Newcomb, Robert Miller, Robert Williams, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, and other Indigenous scholars. I encourage the audience, if you're not familiar with them, to seek out their many works and their critique of colonialism and the doctrine of Christian discovery and domination. I especially recommend Deloria's 1972 An Open Letter to the Heads of the Christian Churches in America and the 2008 Pagans in the Promised Land by Newcomb. Though I won't claim credit for developing the concept of the doctrine of Christian discovery and domination, I have sought to expunge it from our laws, institutions, and worldview. Anyone who has ever taken early American history has heard the story of various early European settlements in what we today call the United States, including Jamestown, Plymouth, and Salem. What gave them the right to enter other people's land and occupy it? The doctrine of Christian discovery and domination sanctioned their invasion. Why is the doctrine of Christian discovery and domination so central to our colonial occupation of Wabanaki peoples and the land they view as a relation? It provides unjustified moral cover for evil and genocidal acts and the legal basis for the stealing of Wabanaki land and asserting settler political control over formerly free and independent peoples. The doctrine of Christian discovery and domination asserts Christians based solely on the fact that they profess to be Christians, in contrast to other individuals and peoples who do not espouse such a religious identity, have a right, blessed by God, to enter non-Christian lands, seize the land and possessions of non-Christians, and kill the original inhabitants unless they instantly submit to the domination of the Christian invaders. This worldview was delineated in a series of papal bulls. Think of them as official pronouncements of the Pope. Scholars generally attribute the first articulation of this concept to the papal bull Deum Diversus issued in 1452. Listen to what Pope Nicholas V wrote in 1452. We grant you, kings of Spain and Portugal, by these present documents, with our apostolic authority, full and free permission to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate the Saracens and pagans and any other unbelievers and enemies of Christ wherever they may be, as well as their kingdoms, duchies, counties, principalities, and other property, and to reduce their persons into perpetual servitude. Spain was not alone using the concept to justify its greed and colonial desire. King Henry VII of England borrows this reasoning, first articulated by Pope Nicholas V, sanctioning John Cabot's voyage to North America. Instead of a papal bull, he uses the instrument of a letters patent. Be it known and made manifest that we have given and granted as by these presents, we give and grant for us and our heirs to our well-beloved John Cabot, citizen of Venice, and to Louis, Sebastian, and Sancio, sons of the said John, to find, discover, and investigate whatsoever islands, countries, regions, or provinces of heathens and infidels in whatsoever part of the world placed, which before this time were unknown to all Christians, and that the before mentioned John and his sons, or their heirs and deputies, may conquer, occupy, and possess whatsoever such towns, castles, cities, and islands by them thus discovered, that they may be able to conquer, occupy, and possess, as our vassals and governors, lieutenants, and deputies therein, acquiring for us the dominion, title, and justification and jurisdiction of the same towns, castles, cities, islands, and mainlands so discovered. The United Nations in 2007 condemned the doctrine of Christian discovery and domination in the preamble to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, affirming further that all doctrines, policies, and practices based on or advocating superiority of peoples and individuals on the basis of national origin or racial, religious, ethnic, or cultural differences are racist, scientifically false, legally invalid, morally condemnable, and socially unjust. Every member state present for the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples voted in support of it, except for Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States. Subsequently, all 4 countries issued qualified statements supporting the declaration. Robert Miller and the co-authors of Discovering Indigenous Lands, the Doctrine of Discovery in the English Colonies, describes 10 elements that constitute the doctrine. The initial one is first discovery. The first European country that discovered lands unknown to other Europeans claimed property and sovereign rights over the lands and indigenous peoples. Listen to how the US Supreme Court incorporates this concept into its decision Johnson versus McIntosh that found the original nations and peoples of this country had a mere right of occupancy, but no legal title to the land. On the discovery of this immense continent, the great nations of Europe were eager to appropriate to themselves so much of it as they could respectively acquire. Its vast extent offered an ample field to the ambition and enterprise of all, and the character and religion of its inhabitants afforded an apology for considering them as a people over whom the superior genius of Europe might claim an ascendancy. The potentates of the old world found no difficulty in convincing themselves that they made ample compensation to the inhabitants of the new by bestowing on them civilization and Christianity in exchange for unlimited independence, freedom. But as they were all in pursuit of nearly the same object, it was necessary, in order to avoid conflicting settlements and consequent war with each other, to establish a principle which all should acknowledge as the law by which the right of acquisition, which they all asserted, should be regulated as among themselves. The principle was that the discovery gave title to the government by whose subjects or by whose authority it was made against all other European governments, which title might be consummated by possession. In the establishment of these relations, the rights of the original inhabitants were in no instance entirely disregarded, but were necessarily, to a considerable extent, impaired. They were admitted to be the rightful occupants of the soil, with a legal as well as just claim to retain possession of it and to use it according to their own discretion. But their rights to complete sovereignty as independent nations were necessarily diminished, and their power to dispose of the soil at their own will to whomsoever they please was denied by the original fundamental principle that discovery gave exclusive title to those who made it. Though Chief Justice Marshall, writing for the Supreme Court, does not use the term Christian discovery, that is the basis for this decision. So a country that purports to keep separate church and state has based the most important Supreme Court decision ever issued affecting the original nations and peoples of this land on a religious concept condemned by the United Nations and many 21st century religious bodies. So I contend the doctrine of Christian discovery and domination serves as the foundation for structural racism in the United States. By structural racism, I mean the entire system of white domination, diffused and infused in all aspects of society, including its history, culture, politics, economics, and entire social fabric. Historically, the doctrine of Christian discovery and domination was explicitly stated as the rationale in papal bulls and royal charters justifying the European invasion of the Western Hemisphere. It impacts our politics in so many profound ways, including who controls specific areas of land and resources, something Darren Ranco and Chelsea Fairbank will address in their lecture that follows mine. Early wealth amassed by settlers and their investors all derives from the taking and stealing of indigenous peoples' lands and resources. This loss is not solely an economic or political loss. For the Wabanaki, it is a soul wound that strikes at the core of Wabanaki worldview, in which they consider the land and all of creation not as something to be exploited for financial gain, but instead a relation to be protected and nurtured. Does anyone believe family members should be bartered, sold, or traded? Despite all the colonial oppression directed at the Wabanaki, they have endured and have refused to become acculturated and assimilated. Unbelievably, Wabanaki tribal governments continue to find themselves constrained by laws rooted in the doctrine of Christian discovery and domination. The most significant of these is the Maine Indian Land Claim Settlement of 1980. The act resulted in response to a land claim initially brought by the Passamaquoddy tribe and later joined by the Penobscot Nation. And during the last year of negotiations that produced the settlement agreement, the Holton Band of Maliseet Indians joined the process. Darren Ranco and Chelsea Fairbank will examine how the doctrine of Christian discovery and domination permeates the struggle between the Penobscot Nation and the state of Maine regarding the takings of the state. I look forward to their presentations.